Hello, today we want to talk about the gospel traditions, and we're going to focus upon the Gospel of Mark and then a literary theory called the two-source hypothesis, which explains the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and those three gospels together are called the synoptic gospels. But first, let's talk about the New Testament as a whole. First thing we need to note is that we have four distinct and major literary genres in the New Testament. First, we have Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then we have letters. We have both the Pauline letters and then the Catholic epistles. So this larger body of letters, 14 in all, written underneath the authorship, or at least assigned to the authorship of Paul. We can break that group down even farther because most biblical scholars today would claim that 7 of those are written by Paul, what are called the authentic letters of Paul. And the remaining are written in his name by members of his school, oftentimes called Deutero-Pauline letters. Now, Hebrews is a special case. Its theology is very distinct from both Paul and the Pauline school. And while it was assigned to Paul, it doesn't seem to have the relationship to his theology that the other letters do. Then we have this group of other letters called the Catholic epistles. This would be 1st, 2nd, and 3rd letter of John. And then we have the 1st and 2nd letter of Peter, the letter of James, and Jude. And those are referred to as Catholic, not because they come from the Roman Catholic Church per se, but because they're seen as being universally addressed, more universal sorts of texts or letters. Less focused upon a particular community and its problems. Then we have Acts, which is a literary type. We have other examples in the ancient Greco-Roman world of a literary genre called Acts, which are stories of people as they travel around and encounter different issues. And we have one example of that, the Acts of the Apostles. And then we have one example of apocalyptic literature, which would be the Book of Revelation, although we certainly have apocalyptic imagery in both the Gospels and also some of the letters of Paul and the Catholic epistles. But we only have one example of a book that falls underneath the genre of apocalyptic literature, and that would be, as I said, the Book of Revelation. Now, before we dive into the New Testament, we need to recognize that there is a cultural divide between the time of Jesus and our time today. So here, taken from Bruce Molina's work on the Synoptic Gospels, is a table that delineates some of these distinctions. So in the first century Mediterranean world, which would include obviously Israel, you have 90% of the population is living out in the country, is rural, while 10% live in the cities and is urban. Well, the exact opposite today in the United States. About 10% of our population lives out in the farmlands, and 90% of our population is in an urban context. Similarly, when you look at how people make their money, in Jesus' day, 95% of the people were involved with farming or extracting raw materials from the land, whether that be mining or what have you, while today only 5% of the population in the United States gains its employment in that manner. Think about educational levels. Again, almost the exact opposite. 2 to 5% of the population in Jesus' time in Israel was literate. They could read and write. Today in the United States, only 2 to 5% of the population is illiterate. Why often when I'm giving talks to parish groups, I'll often ask, can you raise your hand if you know of somebody who cannot read and write, an adult who cannot read and write? And I'll get 1 or 2 hands. And I would say this group of 20 or so, well, if we were living in the time of Jesus and I asked that same question about how many of you know somebody who could not read and write, then all your hands except for 1 or 2 would be up. So, again, very different sort of scenario here in terms of educational level. Then in terms of life expectancy, Jesus' day, 39 was the average life expectancy of an adult. So if we think about Jesus, who's 30 years old usually when he starts, that's a normal assumption, he's around 30 years old when he started his public ministry. Well, he's, we think of him as a young man, but in many ways he's more like, in our contemporary context, more like somebody who's in their 50s or something, more middle age relative to the length of life in that time. Also, notice here that 33% of the children, a third of the children, die before the age of 6. I have 4 sons. That means at least one of them, in this context, would likely have perished by now, before they were even 6 years old. And then if you look here in the United States, well, our life expectancy is almost double that of the time of Jesus. 78 years is the life expectancy in the United States today. And only 3% of the children die before the age of 6 here in our modern context. In terms of the city life and what have you, again, we can see some real distinctions here. In Jesus' day, Jerusalem was probably about 35,000 people, Capernaum about 1,500, Nazareth between 200 and 500, some people go a little higher than that, but you're looking at about 500 people. That's what most people would estimate as Nazareth's population today, or today's estimates would be about 500 people during Jesus' time. Well, contrast that to here in Milwaukee, we have 1 million people in the metropolitan area. Madison is 200,000. I had to kind of struggle to find a town, Wausau, here in Wisconsin, that is about the size of Jerusalem, and probably many of you have not even been to Wausau. It'd be considered a small town, right, in the United States today. There's one statistic where there's a lot of parallel between Jesus' day and our day, and that is this next one, that in Jesus' day, half of all families were broken during childbearing years due to death of one or both parents. So half the children were being raised in a family context where not both parents were alive. That's the same as today, although it's not because of death, but because of divorce mainly. In our modern American context, about half of all children in the United States are not necessarily living in intact families. Then politically, very different kind of context, much more turbulent in the Roman period. Of the 79 Roman emperors, 31 were murdered. That's how you did regime change. 6 committed suicide and 4 were deposed. Well, in our history, 200 and some odd year history in the United States, we've had 45 presidents. Only 3 were have been murdered. And only one, that would be Richard Nixon, you could say, was deposed. Although he resigned before he was actually impeached. But it was certainly that which led to his decision to withdraw from the presidency. So you can see that the context in which the Gospels were written and Jesus lived was almost the exact opposite from our own experience. That should tell us something. It should tell us that we can't just assume we understand the realities that the Gospels are talking about, and we need to do a little work to enter into the world that the Gospels come out of. So what is a gospel? Well, it literally means good news or an announcement. There's debate about what's its literary genre. There's some scholars who say, well, we know the genre. It's ancient biography or bios, often called bios. It's often called. It looks like a bios in terms of talking about one person. But then people point out, no, but there's a lot of features that don't correlate to the Gospels. Maybe that's not really the right group of literature to connect it to. Other people will say, well, it's like a Greek novel. There's some literary overlap between the Gospels and the Greek novel. You can read Joseph and Aniseth would be an example of a Greek novel. But there's some real distinctions, so that doesn't seem to fit either. I'd say the dominant position amongst biblical scholars is that while there's certainly some corollaries to other literary genres, that the Gospel is almost sui generis. It's unique, the literary form that seems to have grown up within the Christian context, so that this is maybe best understood as being a particularly Christian mode of writing. Its language is Koine Greek. Koine means common, and so it's kind of the common Greek. It's not the highfalutin Greek of its day. And here I give a definition of what a gospel is in the last bullet point. So I write here, a gospel is a literary work that proclaims a faith-filled portrait of Jesus by reproducing representative words and deeds from the community's stories about his life. And we will unpack that here in a moment. But before we get to that, we want to talk about the 3 stages of formation. Here I give you the citation from Dei Verbum, as well as the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because this is the standard understanding of how the Gospels came to be. And of course, the first stage of their coming to be was the life and teaching of Jesus during his public ministry and life. So there we have it from, and most people would say that most scholars recognize that Jesus was not born at 0 BC or 0 CE, but probably about 3 years earlier. And of course, I'm using here BCE, before the Common Era, that abbreviation. So probably born about 4 BC, and he dies around 30 CE, which means Common Era, present, or we might say AD. But he died, therefore, about 34 years old. So after Jesus' death, well, you have oral traditions where people are talking about who he was and communicating his message through verbal communication. Now, why don't people write things down right away? Well, because that's one of the least efficient ways you could communicate. Since, as we pointed out, that only 3 to 5% of the population could read and write in Jesus' day, well, reading that in that context, then, writing it down would ensure that 95% of the population or more might not be able to understand it, would not understand it, unless somebody read it to them, which did happen. People who could read might read for the whole group. But this is a highly inefficient means of communication. And in fact, we sort of privilege the written word. I would say in the ancient world, there was a sense that the oral mode of communication was superior to the written. So that, we can't just necessarily import our biases and understandings into the ancient context. Now, in that oral tradition stage, we do have certain texts being written. Paul's letters being a good example. He's writing to these different communities as early as around 50. So it's not as if there aren't some written documents, and even our written Gospels, as you can see here, start to be written around 65 or 68 CE. And 95 is usually the date given to John's Gospel, which is the last Gospel that's written, that's in the canonical, the canon. But the point being that the earliest stage is oral, and then over time, these texts start to get written down. Now, why? Why do they start writing down these stories, the story of Jesus' life and what have you? Well, a couple reasons. One, probably the people who walked around with Jesus, his disciples, were dying. And so there was a motivation to capture what they had to say, because, of course, the value of a written text is that it is sustainable. It has a life beyond that of the person who's telling you the story. So there may have been a motivation. Let's get this written down before the disciples who really knew Jesus died. We need to archive this material, if you will. Another reason might be that now you have Christianity spreading into wealthier contexts, that the earliest followers of Jesus were coming from the lower class who could not read and write. But now we're moving into a period where people of a higher economic status were being attracted to Christianity. They had both the knowledge in terms of reading and writing, but also the means to hire people to write. This was a highly developed skill to write something, and so even people who could read didn't necessarily know how to write. And so you had patrons who could pay for those who could write down the story, or provide the resources for a person to write down the story, because papyri was expensive and what have you. So even if you had the skill, did you have the resources you need to be able to write down the stories? So these are different reasons why. And a third reason would be, while oral communication can be an effective means to getting information out, it's not fixed. It's variable, or can be much more variable than a written text. And so as Christianity is spreading about, there may be a sense that we need a more definitive account. And again, one of the advantages of a written text is it's fixed. So now we have, so if you will, an authoritative telling of Jesus' life that's not as fluid as the oral tradition. And there's a need for that so that we all kind of have a sense of connection to one another. We all have a similar understanding of who he is and what his message was. All right. Now, I always like to start to talk about Gospels by asking this question: what does Jesus' life mean for the person of faith today? If you were asked by your parish community to come and give, to answer that question, well, how would you answer it? How would you tell the story of Jesus? What does Jesus' life mean for the person of faith today? And you know, let's say you're going to give an adult formation presentation on this. Well, and I only set one caveat, is that you have to retell stories picked from Jesus' life. The way what stories you might pick out might vary, and one reason it might vary is that you might look at the community you're going to address. What does this community need to hear? How do they need to be confronted by, or consoled by, or challenged by, or moved by the message of Jesus and his life? And so the stories you pick and the way you tell the stories, the order you put them, might be dependent more upon the needs of your audience than trying to necessarily just give a biography of Jesus. And what you might want to do at some point is, if you imagine your own parish community, what would be those 3 or 4 stories that you would select, and how would you order them? It's a nice exercise to try to undertake. So that's not so different than how the Gospels came to be. I like to use this string of beads analogy. So if you look up here at number 1, we have the Gospel writers receive the sort of basic outline of the events of Jesus' life. That's called the charismatic string. And they got that from here's our string right here. You can see it running through. So there's a basic framework of Jesus' life. But then they've collected through oral stories and written sources the words and deeds of Jesus. And, so we have some miracles, and we have some words, maybe parables, we have some actions, cleansing the temple, what have you. The gospel writers don't necessarily know exactly where on this basic charismatic string where those things belong. They might have a rough idea, but not necessarily. And besides, they're not really interested in telling you a biography. This is not a bios. We're not trying to give an exact accounting of the chronology of Jesus' life. Instead, what they're trying to do is proclaim Jesus' life, as I state here in the 3rd point. And so they organize these beads, this material, in a patterned way so as to address the fundamental question of their faith community. What does Jesus mean for us, and given our context? And so we'll see variation between the 4 Gospels. And one reason for that, besides having some different traditions, but one reason for that is because the evangelist, the gospel writer, is trying to address the needs of the community, to make Jesus truly become alive, to be present to them. And how you stress certain stories and how you focus on certain elements of his life will be more effective than others. And we know this is what they did because one of the earliest church historians, Eusebius, tells us this is how the Mark was written. So Eusebius is writing in the late 3rd, early 4th century, and he liked to quote from earlier works. So in this passage here, he actually claims that he's taking this passage from Papias, who was a bishop who lived from about 60 to 130. So you notice that Jesus died in 30. Papias is born in 60, so he's very close to the time of Jesus' life. And so this is Papias, who tells us about how Mark wrote his gospel. Right? And here's what Papias, as recorded in Eusebius, says. It says, Mark, having become the interpreter or translator, the Greek can go either way here, how we might translate this word, So Mark, having become the interpreter or translator of Peter, wrote down accurately, now this is key, though not indeed in order. So right away, Papias is telling us, he didn't give us an exact chronology of when things happened, but he wrote them down accurately, but though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things done or said by the Lord. Now remember, who's doing this? This is Mark, and he's remembering how these different stories that Peter told him. And for he, that is Mark, neither heard nor followed the Lord, but afterwards, as I said, he followed Peter. Now this is key. Who adapted his teachings to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving an orderly account of the Lord's sayings. Or logiai, that's the word in Greek. Accordingly, Mark did no wrong in thus writing some things as he remembered them, for he made it his aim to omit nothing he had heard and to state nothing therein falsely. So notice this. Basically, Papias is saying Mark did what Peter did. Peter would tell the story of Jesus, select the stories of Jesus, put them in order to address the needs of his hearers so that they could truly encounter Christ. And wasn't really focused too much on ordering them. Mark has a bit of an interest in doing the same thing. Because he's not, we're told here by Papias, he didn't put them in order, perfect chronological order, but he did tell them accurately. He's reporting what he had heard. So this is what we're learning here, is that little exercise I had you just do about giving a talk to your parish is exactly what the gospel writer Mark has done too, in imitation of Peter. Because the key thing isn't to tell chronology of Jesus. No, the key thing is to encounter Jesus. And so you tell the story of Jesus in a way that it fosters that. And some sort of factual, minute-by-minute timeline is not necessarily the goal of the gospel. It's rather trying to give this sort of visceral, meaningful, transforming experience of the Lord Jesus Christ. All right. So, what we learn from Eusebius, who's quoting Papias, is like Peter, like Paul. So Mark's not an eyewitness. He learned about Jesus through Peter. And all of our gospel writers, even Matthew and John, sometimes people will point to them as being disciples because there's names of disciples with those who are named Matthew and John. But no, Matthew and John both are not eyewitnesses. They come after the time of Jesus and are, like Mark, have getting their traditions from and their stories from people who did follow Jesus. Okay, so Mark's not an eyewitness. He learns this about Jesus through Peter. And as we said, Peter did not give an orderly account of Jesus' life when he spoke to different people, when he went out to evangelize, but rather selected and adapted the stories to meet the audience's particular needs and circumstances, and Mark did the same thing. He imitates Peter's example and to address his community's needs. So, the implications. The way that Mark constructs his story of Jesus reveals the burning issue within his community, since he, like Peter, ordered the sayings and events in the story with the goal of addressing the faith community's pressing needs. This is a very crucial principle within modern biblical scholarship. This is called in German, Sitzenleben, situation in life. What's the Sitzenleben of the community? If we can figure that out, it'll help us understand the theology of Mark, help us understand his goals, and so therefore the gospel reveals more about what's the situation of Mark's community, and by that we can understand why he tells the story in the manner that he does about Jesus. Okay, now I sometimes ask students after they've finished reading Mark, and hopefully you've all read Mark by now. So if you had to come up with a theme song for the Gospel of Mark, and if you just took a song that's out in the popular culture right now, You won't have to write your own, because if you're like me, you're musically challenged. But if you were to identify some song, excuse me, that now presently exists, and that would be apropos to serve as the theme song for the Gospel of Mark, much like, you go to Star Wars, and we all know that Star Wars theme song. What would it be? And here's my candidate. Okay, you know that song. It's called, actually, officially, William Tell's Overture. William Tell's Overture, but we might more commonly know it as the theme song for the TV show The Lone Ranger. Maybe I'm dating myself here a bit, but why do I say the theme song for the Gospel of Mark is the William Tell Overture? Well, because I think we can summarize the Gospel of Mark into 6 themes, and they are an acronym that spells Ranger, like the Lone Ranger. So what are these 6 themes that are sort of distinctive about Mark's Gospel when we compare it to Luke and Matthew? Well, okay, so the first thing is that we have Jesus coming to reclaim the earth in Mark's Gospel. It starts, if you notice, with Jesus' baptism. It doesn't start with the nativity scene. Instead, we have Jesus coming into the world, and he is very crucial, by the way, to notice that it says here in the first verse, chapter 1, first verse, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, that's not a sentence. It's the first verse. It's not a sentence. You know why? Because there's no verb. And actually, this translation is a little bit flawed because it says the beginning, but there's no the in Hebrew. There's no ho in Hebrew there. It is just beginning. It starts with the word beginning. So actually, we should translate this: beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's the title of the book. So the Gospel of Mark, that title was added later on when the tradition developed that the author of this gospel was Mark. But the title that the author gave, that Mark gave to his own work, was beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. No verb, no definite article. These are both signs that this is a title. There's some other indications as well. This is significant because think about that a little bit. Beginning of the gospel. It's not saying this is, and sometimes translations will do this. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you put an is in there, then you mean, okay, well, then we go right from that passage, that verse rather, to the passage about the preaching of John the Baptist. You say, well, here's the start of the story. In the kind of a once upon a time sort of thing, or what have you, introduction to the book. Nope. This is the title. So what it's saying, and of course this gospel ends with Jesus dying, and actually one of the mysteries of this text is that in its original version it ends with the empty tomb. Now later on, and if you read your footnotes as you read the Gospel of Mark, you found out that people started to add in resurrection visions or narratives into this gospel. They added endings, expanded the ending to talk about Jesus, people encountering Jesus in his resurrected form. But clearly the textual evidence we have is that the original ending was that the disciples see the tomb empty and are amazed. Why would they end it there? Well, because it's volume 1. If the title of this book is beginning, that must mean it's part 1. There must be a part 2. Just like most scholars would say, the Gospel of Luke is volume 1 of Luke's work, and the Acts of the Apostles is volume 2. So that he picks up, right, what's Acts about is about the life of the community. And what the early disciples do after Jesus' resurrection. Well, I think Mark has the same idea, that he's only going to tell you about what Christ did in his earthly ministry, but he has a sense that the story of Jesus Christ is not over. There's a volume 2. What's the volume 2? You and me, and all those Christians since the time of Jesus. That the volume 2 is the work of the church to continue trying to finish the project of Jesus. And what's the project of Jesus? Well, a big part of that is reclaiming the earth for God. And there's a sense that Satan has taken over this corner of the universe. And God has now sent his Son to reclaim it, to take it back from Satan. So this is a major sort of theme running through Matthew's text. And, the first words out of Jesus' mouth, in fact, is that it says that, he says this is chapter 1, verse 14, after John had been arrested, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God. Repent, the time of fulfillment. This is the time of fulfillment, or the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. So this is the time of fulfillment. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. So Jesus is initiating this reclaiming project. All right, so that's the R. We could go farther into all these themes. We'll just kind of briefly cover them today. Another kind of unique character to Mark's gospel is Mark continually has people who've been healed by Jesus. They're told by Jesus, don't tell anybody that I did this, And then, of course, they immediately go out and tell everybody. This is called the Messianic secret. This kind of is not as present in other gospels. And so there's this sense that who is this masked man? Jesus, who is this guy? They're trying to figure him out, particularly in the first half of the gospel. And in some ways, the disciples don't quite get Jesus. His identity's confusing to them because they don't have the right categories. So that's why I call them Nimrodic disciples. Now, what's interesting about that word Nimrodic is that, of course, it comes from the word Nimrod. And we use that term as sort of a derogatory term or adjective. You're a real Nimrod. Interesting enough, you'll find in northern Michigan, there's a high school who are the Fighting Nimrods. You're like, well, that's kind of unfortunate. But Nimrod in the Bible was a very strong warrior and hunter, particularly a very skillful hunter. Why did Nimrod become that term get negative connotations? Is actually because of Bugs Bunny in our modern American context. Because Bugs Bunny would call Elmer Fudd a real Nimrod. Elmer Fudd was always trying to kill Bugs Bunny. So that's how, in our American modern context, we think of you. If you're a Nimrod, you're kind of a doofus. But in ancient in biblical stories, it's a skilled hunter. Well, these disciples, it worked perfectly for me here in terms of calling the disciples Nimrodic, because they don't quite get Jesus. They're kind of clueless, but ultimately, I think the point will be that they carry forth the message of Jesus. So they are skillful when they fully understand who Jesus is through his resurrection. But in the story here in the beginning, they're kind of clueless. They kind of bumble about a bit, more than some of the other Gospels. All right, then the next letter, G. One reason I like the theme song to be this William Tell overture, because it gets to this point. This giddy-up gospel. It's a very fast-paced gospel. And, there's this word uthos in Greek, which means then, and then, this happens, then this, immediately. Or another way it's translated is immediately. Immediately, uthos. Immediately, Jesus does this. Immediately, he does this. 40 times, over 40 times that word shows up in Mark's gospel. And if you read Mark, there's very little interruption with long discourses or anything like that. It just keeps going from one miracle to the next miracle, to the next words, the next action. It's an action-focused gospel. And so people will say this is a gospel in a hurry. It's also the shortest gospel. But that's why I like to call it the giddy-up gospel. And then our E is Eucharistic power. I go for a long time to talk about this, but there's a key way in which I think Mark's community is dealing with a little bit of anxiety that Yeah, when Jesus was around, he could beat up on Satan, and he's able to, really have an effect upon the world around him. But now we're here, and they're probably feeling some stress themselves as a community. They're probably feeling that they're being beat up on now, whether that be by the Romans or even by their own families, because they've abandoned either whether it's the Jewish faith or whatever faith tradition they're coming out of. They've joined this new group that is looked upon with some suspicion, and so they feel like they're losing ground. Jesus was here, sure, he was reclaiming the territory of the earth for God. Now we're shrinking. The world's beating up on us. And I think one of the points that Mark wants to make to his community is, you don't understand the Eucharist. You don't understand that the power of God is present within that. And if we had time, we could really unpack that. I could make that argument exegetically. But I think this is one of the messages that Mark wants to communicate to his community is, if you really understood, if the disciples' problem was they didn't quite get who Jesus was, they didn't really understand him. And if they had, they would have, had a better sense of joining Jesus' effort. Well, we have the same phenomenon going on in our own lives, I think Mark wants to say. If we really understood how Christ was still present in the world through the Eucharist, that bread of life would be active in our actions, and we would truly be able to move mountains, as he says in chapter 11. And then the second R is redemptive suffering, that in Mark's gospel, some people will call Mark's gospel a passion narrative with an introduction. That the focus, particularly the second half of the gospel onwards, is this long march to Calvary. Jesus heading towards his death. And this gets stressed, 3 key points within the second half of the gospel, where Jesus talks about having to go and die for the sake of others. And so this idea that his suffering is to redeem the world as part of this bigger plan is a key theme within Mark's gospel. So those are the key, and now, of course, with the other gospels, there's some overlays or connections with these themes to those. But these are really, in terms of a collection of major themes, this is distinctive in some ways, this particular collection, to Mark. And we could do that with every gospel. In fact, I've done it with every gospel, as others have long before me. But you can identify certain emphases within each gospel, and it tells you something about the community that the gospel writer is addressing. In this case with Mark, I think this is a community under stress. As I said, they're feeling a little bit alone and isolated. They're feeling like the world's sort of beating up on them, and Mark wants to give them hope. And one way he gives them hope is not only by showing the great works of God through Jesus, but even showing how the disciples struggled a little bit. And I think the point of that is like, look, if you're struggling right now, that's okay. So did the disciples. That's all right. That's part of the process of discipleship, of not quite getting the fullness of it. You got to grow into the fullness of it in some ways, and truly come to understand the presence of Christ, not only in his words and deeds, but also in the Eucharist, how he's continually present in the community through that action. So this is, I think, what Mark's up to. All right. So if we were to look at Mark, just sort of some key elements. Usually it's dated sometime between 65 and 70 CE. All right. The temple is destroyed in 68. That's when the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans. And there's reasons why people see this text being written even just shortly before that happens or shortly after it happens. And we don't have time to go through that. As I said, the audience is seen as a persecuted group of Christians. The sources that the gospel writer is using are oral and some written sources. We have some evidence of some written sources, particularly in chapter 5. So he probably has some, not a whole gospel, but little pieces of different things that he's drawing upon. The structure is what's called two parts. You can divide this a couple different ways, the structure of the gospel, but this is the one I like, and it's pretty common in biblical scholarship to talk about. This is a two-part story. First half, Jesus is battling through miracles and what have you to establish the kingdom of God. The second half, he's making this journey to the cross and stressing suffering as an essential element to discipleship. I think the overall theme is that Jesus' power and presence is available through the Eucharist, which sustains disciples during their suffering to continue the ongoing struggle to establish the kingdom of God here on earth. That would be my encapsulation of the main theme. Not all biblical scholars would articulate it that way. But here I'm depending upon Laverdiere's, Father Laverdiere's masterful commentary on Mark. I find that convincing and persuasive. And he starts his gospel with the baptism, which is different from Matthew and Luke, as well as John. And it ends at an empty tomb, as I already mentioned. Later writers add on some resurrection narrative, because I don't think they get the point of Mark's gospel, what he's up to in terms of this being just the beginning of Jesus Christ, not the full story of Jesus, because I think for Mark, the full story starts the second half, volume 2, starts with Jesus' resurrection, and it's through that resurrection that he's still present to us today. All right, so let's move now. We're not going to talk about John. John's a distinctive gospel in its presentation and theology. But we will talk briefly about Matthew and Luke, because these three Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and Mark, are called the synoptic Gospels. Why? Because the word syn in Greek means with, and optic, we all know that, because we all go to the ophthalmologist and what have you. The optometrician means eye. So with one eye. So these three Gospels have a similar portrayal of Jesus. At least they share some of the same sayings and stories and vocabulary. A lot in common. So how do we account for that commonality? Well, you could say that's oral tradition, but and there's a lot more we can say about this, and I'm sure you'll cover more of this in your Cornerstone 2 course, but when you really focus upon the Gospels. But let's outline for you the major literary theory about how we account for these similarities. What I put up here is a chart of the relationship between the three Gospels. And you can see Mark is in this sort of pink color, and you can see what Mark shares with Luke and Matthew. So what's shared between those three Gospels is called the triple tradition, because it shows up in three different Gospels. Triple. Then we have some material that's unique just to Mark. You see that's in the brown. Some material that's unique just to Luke. You see that's in that aqua blue color. And some material that's unique just to Matthew. And that's in that green color. So in other words, that's material that nobody else, no other of these three Gospels records or has present in them. Now notice how little, in comparison to Matthew and Luke, how little is unique to Mark. Almost everything that's in Mark shows up in at least one other Gospel. And the majority of Mark shows up in these two other Gospels. So the theory here is that Mark was the first Gospel written, and that both Luke and Matthew have Mark in front of them. They've read Mark. They have a copy of Mark. And Luke and Matthew both have they say, wow, this is a really good Gospel, but. And what's the but? Well, there's some material he left out. There's a lot more, some good stuff that's not in here. Now, what's this good stuff? Well, some of this stuff is stuff that both Matthew, as another document, is the theory, called Q, which comes from a German word Quelle, which means source. So there's a source, another source. You got Mark as one source. You got this Q source is another. And that's called, what's shared between Luke and Matthew is called the double tradition. You see that in the blue, right? You see how they're sharing some similar material that's not in Mark, because Mark doesn't have Q. It's a list of sayings that he evidently didn't know existed. And then, all right, so you can see how this breaks down. And so this is key, that we have this theory. Now, you can say, well, that's an interesting theory. What's the basis for it? And Well, we have a clue that from Luke himself that this was his method. So if you go to chapter 1, verse 1 in Luke, it says there, can I find it? It says, chapter 1, verse 1, Gospel of Luke. Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us. So notice that. He knows there's other narratives. He knows there's other Gospels. Just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, like Eusebius and Papias said happened with Mark, I too have decided, this is the Gospel writer of Luke, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus. Now, who's this most excellent Theophilus? Well, two possibilities. One is, this is a patron. This is a person with money who said, Luke, I got different versions of the story of Jesus. Why don't you write down a fuller account for me? And so Theophilus might be the gospel writer's patron who provided him with the resources to undertake this project. I'm about to go on sabbatical. I got a grant to do my research project. That's my patron. All right. Or what's sort of interesting too is this name, Theophilus, means lover of God. So another theory is this is not a historical person, but rather anyone who loves God. So that maybe Luke, is actually writing for all of us because we're all lovers of God. That's who motivated him. Two different theories, but certainly we have a lot of texts where we have an introduction like this, and it's sort of like the preface. Let's say when I write my book, I'll just say, I thank the Catholic Biblical Association, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops for their grant they gave me. I'll acknowledge their role in supporting my project. Okay, so finishing this up, he decided to write, after investigating everything anew, to write an orderly account, my most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teaching you have received. So this point I made earlier, why you start writing Gospels, well, so you can kind of have an authoritative telling of Jesus' life. Oral traditions are a little more too fluid. All right, so what do we see here in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4? He knows there are other written Gospels, and he's read them, and he's using them in writing his Gospel. So this whole theory that we just looked at with that Luke is borrowing from Mark, he basically has told us that's my method. I investigated this, and I'm using these sources I found to write this Gospel. All right, so here's the two-source hypothesis, although it should more accurately be called the four-source theory, which we'll see why in a moment. So first thing is you have this document Q, which is a list of sayings. It's not a life, just a saying after saying after saying of Jesus, And then you have the Gospel of Mark, which is it has a narrative thread to it. It tells the story of Jesus. Well, Matthew says, hey, I like this Q, I like this Mark, let's put them together. And Luke does the same thing. Hey, I like this Mark, I like this Q, let's put them together. But neither one knows the other one has done it. Right? They're doing this separately. And then Matthew says, you know what? And he has some other material. Could be oral material, could be a couple of written sources. And he puts that material into his gospel, right? And then Luke, same thing. He has some unique material that's just his own that he adds into his gospel. And that's how you get these three gospels that have a lot of similarities to each other, yet some distinctiveness. All right. So now let's give you an example using the baptism of Jesus. Now, again, we're assuming that Mark was written first. And notice what it says here. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately, Uthos, he saw the heavens open and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. And a voice came from the heavens, you are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased. All right, good? Now, interestingly, you have some questions here. If I'm Matthew or Luke, and I'm reading this, I'm like, well, who heard the voice? This you is that, what's the options? Could be Jesus, right? Maybe only Jesus heard this voice. He came out of the water. Did John the Baptist hear this voice? All right. So what are you going to do? How are you going to make some decisions about this? Well, they probably have different traditions, and they try to clarify this. So what do we see? We see here in Matthew that notice here, it says that Jesus, kind of the same thing, came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. And notice here, John, this is different. This is not in Mark, but he talks about, you should be baptizing me. Jesus says, let it be done now to fulfill all righteousness. That's a big theme in Matthew, this idea of righteousness and fulfilling the Scriptures. And it says here that when Jesus came out, immediately the heavens were open and the Spirit descends. And then it says, a voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Now, this is the key word, this. Because if I had my son next to me, and I turned to him and said, "You are my beloved Son," you'd probably assume I'm talking just to him. But if I said, "This is my beloved Son," I'm probably speaking to somebody else. It'd be a weird way to address my son if I said, "This is my beloved Son." And nobody else is supposed to hear this. So Matthew tells the story in a manner that he thinks John the Baptist heard that voice. Notice Luke. He actually, he tells the story, starts a little differently. He talks about how John the Baptist was put into prison, right? Now, he has him, that is, has Jesus at the Jordan, and John the Baptist is baptizing people, but he tells us, oh, by the way, this is the same John that got arrested by Herod. So it kind of takes John even off stage in a way, if that makes sense. And then it says here in verse 21, now when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized, so it's done, and was praying. So now he's praying. He's off to the side praying. The heavens was opened up. The heaven was opened up, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form as a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." So a couple things here. First off, this stress upon praying. That's going to, in Luke's gospel, when anything key happens, Jesus has just prayed or in the midst of praying. So that's a unique feature within Luke. Not that it isn't in the other gospels, but it's a particular emphasis about him, the power of prayer. And but notice this, he's off praying by himself. It's after the fact. He's out of the water. And so I think from Luke's perspective, I think only Jesus heard that voice. So both of these, writers, Matthew and Luke, have Mark in front of them. And they really don't know. Did John the Baptist hear this voice or not? They don't have the sources to tell them. As they think about it, it's not that important to know exactly what John the Baptist heard, because they know what the meaning of John the Baptist's testimony was. That's the important point. And so they're going to tell the story in a way that fits the needs of their community, what their needs are, so they truly encounter Christ. And we'd have to look at Matthew and Luke to kind of understand why they told the story in these ways, but this makes perfectly good sense. The way they did it, how they sort of solved the problem, a question at least, within Mark's gospel about who heard this, in a manner that fits the needs of their community, right, in terms of how they tell it. All right, so that's the key point there we have about the synoptic problem. So I'll go back to this chart real quick. So this is basically the theory about the two-source hypothesis. But want to really return back to the main theme. And the main theme is that all the gospel writers tell the story in a manner to help us encounter Christ. That's the point. To have some experience of the risen Lord through the telling of his earthly ministry, so that we truly become disciples. And they use certain sources, certainly tied to history. They're to traditions, but they're telling it in a manner to engender faith, not dry biography or chronology. All right, I hope that's helpful to get a sense of the gospel traditions and a little bit of digging into Mark. As I said, next semester you'll get a much more thorough coverage of these, not just these three gospels, but all four gospels and the rest of the New Testament. All right, take care.